Hi guys, this is Lee for Middle Child, and today I am recording a little thing that I like to call the long walk home. I don't know, just an idea. I apologize for the incoming sound that you might hear. I'm recording this while I walk without editing, hoping to capture the ebb and flow of life and hoping to capture the thickness of my own life in the way that a conversation might if I were calling you. So you might call this the long call home. But what I'm trying to do is to figure myself out, to figure my life out, and to be self conscious about myself. So let us begin the long call home with a prayer to the absurdity of figuring yourself out. Let us pay tribute, at least momentarily, to how ridiculous it is to have this kind of conversation. But first, a sound check. So the sound quality is high enough to warrant that recording. And so I began with that tribute to the absurdity because it's important to see the inherent contradiction in a man who is effectively recording monologues, self-critical, self-aware monologues that are not only about what he loves the most, which is philosophy, poetry, and life, but are recordings that are in many ways personal insofar as I can't escape the personal. And so as much as I would like this to be an exploration of the theoretical, it turns out also necessarily to be an examination of the personal. And so I say that as a way of introducing what I call the absurd. And I speak without resolution. I speak without any sense of enclosure, any sense of finality. However, I speak also without being completely relative, without being completely subjective. And again, I said it before in these recordings that I apologize for being obtuse, but I'm finding my way into what I'm also finding my way out of. And so let us pay homage to our own capacity for obfuscation. Let us have a moment of silence for the ambiguous. It is said that there's a difference, though, between being unnecessarily obscure and being obscure because life itself is inherently difficult. But that's not the same thing as saying that things can be understood paradoxically, because paradoxes exist only in the mind. They're not in reality. Reality is not paradoxical. And yet, at the same time, reality is not as simple and clear as the rationalist among us would like to think that it is. So then what is it? Well, it has degrees of both. And so the difficulty that I'm dealing with here is one in which I tend to veer into the more than complex and thus the more than ambiguous or the obtuse, the obfuscated, as opposed to the truly difficult. Because it could be that what's truly difficult, it could be that what I'm missing is right in front of me and has been there all along. And so there's a third kind of prayer that can be made at the beginning, opening salvo of this recording. And that is a prayer to that in itself, which is missing that which is right in front of us. In psychology, they call it a scotoma, and that is missing that which is right in front of you. And you could say that what is meant by this is that all of us can benefit from seeing what we might be missing because it's already there. And so it could be that I'm missing what is already there, and it could be that I need others That's all we need are others to point that out to us, to point out what is already there, because it could be the reason why. I'm just guessing. It could be that the reason why you feel a lack or you feel like there's something missing isn't because there is something missing, but because there's something there all along that you didn't know was there. Now, again, it's not to speak intentionally, paradoxically. I don't mean to do that, but I cannot help but do that. And it's also because perhaps I have a taste for poetry and language. Perhaps I have a taste for language that tends to clothe itself in Baroque drab. It's a language that seeks to become beautiful as much as true. And so let us pay tribute to that. And once we've gotten that out of the way, we can begin thinking clearly about that which cannot be thought clearly about, and that is life and what one is doing. I am tired and I am enduring great difficulties, but I'm also keeping my head above water, and I'm aware of enough things at once to keep me centered. And it's almost as if what we know played a role in the buoyancy of our souls. And I am recording this also as a way of creating a kind of private recording for myself, because one of the dimensions of what I do is to form connections with others that aren't merely intellectual, but that are rooted in the specificity of my own life. And that specificity is something that you will never nail down unless you try. And so it's important to be clear and be direct. And I think that one of the troubling features of our time is the atomization and isolation of people everywhere. And it's not that this is inherently bad, but that if one isn't attentive in themselves to the possible consequences of this, you run the risk of being drowned, of being swallowed. And so you sort of have to figure out a way of um, you have to find a way of making do. So I suppose these recordings are a part of bricolage. It's a French word that's important to me, and it effectively means making what one needs out of what one has, and that's what these recordings are. I'm very typical of the people who are like cosmic cowboys, in the sense that they are living isolated lives where you're working a job and then returning to a life where you live online and you live without a social world and you live without a personal life. Except that I think I'm one of those who isn't, um, I'm not necessarily hurt by it. I'm not necessarily broken by our world. I'm not in despair. I'm not alienated. I don't feel depressed. And so I think it allows you a certain degree of objectivity. Once you're able to um, see yourself clearly for what you are, you can also get free of the feelings associated with it. Of course, that would take a long time to explain, but what I mean to say is that it's easy for me to be clear about my situation because I don't necessarily see it in a moral way, and I don't necessarily see it as something that I need to change. Um, and so I think when you relax into it, it really gives you that kind of peace of mind to be able to sort of see it for what it is, and to be able to uh, recognize, what it is that you need to do. And that's what these recordings are. They're a way for me to not only communicate with others or make contact with others, but also um, to hear myself speak, because there's a level at which what you're practicing is a way of speaking in which you have to ask yourself, what are we doing when we speak? And one of those features of speech is not only to communicate, I think, but also to hear yourself speaking. And so it's no wonder that many people write or talk because they want to know what they think. And it's very interesting, whether you're with yourself or with others, to experience this sense in which we often change whenever we are reflected back in another person's reaction or in simply seeing ourselves for what we are. And it's not that you can get outside of yourself and see yourself for what you are, but that you can see it in certain literary examples, like in the work of Shakespeare and Cervantes. There's a sense in which characters begin to change, and that changing of characters in those works, in many ways, may be a literary construction, and it may be a literary construction, and it may be that the human consciousness itself is a kind of construction. But regardless, the degree to which one practices this, one becomes a kind of character who isn't what one started out to be. One becomes something other than what they were. And I think that self-overhearing is one of the great benefits of these kind of recordings, because simply in hearing myself, you can hear yourself, and it could be it's a continuation of that very process that leads me to this. And so it could be that simply in talking about my own life and where I'm at, that I'm able to hear what I need to hear, because, to be short, whatever you're living without that kind of conversation, if you don't have someone in your house or someone in your community that you can go to, how are you supposed to hear yourself? If you're not writing for someone else, and if you're not speaking in such a way where you're building communion with other people, how is it that you're supposed to develop? And again, that's the nature of Bricolage, is to make use of what one has, and these little meditative practices, these little recordings that I do in the brief moments before I go to work are essential in that practice. And the reason I paid homage to what is ridiculous is that for years I've already made these recordings and done them day after day without ever thinking I was going anywhere. And however, what I realize is that there's something that is building in these recordings, because I accidentally go back and listen to them, and I suddenly hear, because I'm able to get that kind of perspective on myself that comes with time and distance, to hear that there's value in it. And it could be that practice of working on writing and reading for years and years, even though it felt like there was no point to it, it feels like there is a point to it that's becoming eminent or imminent. And so that's kind of tied to what it is that I'm trying to say about the questions regarding what my life is. Because if you ask me what it is that I like to do, I would tell you I like to read and write, speak and listen, and to weave as many moments of grace out of the day as I can. But also, there's another kind of deeper question that demands another kind of longer response, and that is the question of how the hell I'm going to get myself out of the situation I'm in, where, I've been doing this practice all these years with reading and writing, but here I am working a regular job, trying to build a life, but also dying inside, and also realizing that I've yet to take seriously the questions that I asked when I was younger. It's interesting, because I was so wrapped up, I was so serious, so quote unquote deep when I was young, that I think that ultimately you sort of get stuck in that world. And when you pull back, it's interesting how as time flies by, you sort of begin to change in yourself. And that turning is what's interesting when you look back, and you can see much more clearly how it is that you've turned And I think these recordings are done in that spirit because when I listen back, I will at least get to hear how I had turned, and I will at least get to see the precipice upon which I had to make those choices, those decisions, which I'm at now. And the only advantage I have is the kind of crude knowledge that I gained so far. But the more immediate question is, beyond the speculative, beyond poetry and philosophy, what instrumentally is one to do? And so I think I want to get paid to write, and I want to get paid to create value and create content. And that sort of has to begin with that belief that I can do that, and that I can create content and value. And so I'm releasing these recordings. Um, maybe not this one. Maybe this one is a bit too private, but I'm releasing these as a way of getting myself out there because perfectionism isn't going to be found, you know. And so it's been for 2 months now since I turned 40 that I've been struggling to put out these, to create this thing. And if I'm not pushing myself into it, it's not going to happen. There has to be a momentum that's created with my writing and with my recording. And I'm trying to create that momentum because, you know, every day I read, and then my goal is to like write and then do recordings if I can. And I've been very, very limited in this ability. And I've ultimately learned that, yes, there is peace to be found. Like, there is an underlying sense if you were listening to me at which you would hear that there's a sense in which I'm striving to understand myself and understand my life and to exert control and power over it. And a lot of people would see the limitations in this, and they would see that it's important to be able to live your life without being dominated by the mind, you know? You can free your soul by opening up your heart. And I think that's true. And I suppose that one of the things that I bring to the table is that I have, I think, maybe more to say than I thought I did, more to offer than I thought I did, because in regards to that, I do think peace can be found. I think that one can discover a kind of happiness within oneself and live. However, it doesn't mean that's necessarily what I'm going to do, because think about my life right now after turning 40 is that I've turned my life around a lot in the last 8 years, because it was 8 years ago that I moved out on my own and began to really challenge myself and push myself in the broadest sense of physically, emotionally, mentally. And I moved out alone on my own to be by myself and live with myself. And then I also learned how to work a regular job. I learned how to turn around and face the decisions and mistakes that I made in the past. And I've learned how to turn within and to see those demons and to see that darkness. And I've lived through that. And it's all been quiet because I've simply allowed myself to relax into building a life. And so rather than pursuing some romantic dream of like, or some like entrepreneurial dream, like I'd imagined, you know, because my entire life had been made up of striving for one thing after another, trying to be something or trying to create something or trying to do something. And without the right kind of discipline and finesse, it ultimately leads to a kind of waking mess. And so that's where I found myself with that phrase returning in my memory. And in many ways, it's at the heart of what I'm doing now. However, the time has come to turn again, you know, and I can feel it in my bones because the limitation that I have now is that I'm just exhausted and worn out. And it's not that I work 80 hours a week. You know, I only work 6 shifts a week at the job that I have. And I've had to work these hours, at least I told myself, because I was building a life. And I've ultimately allowed myself to live in the nicest place I've ever had. I have, you know, central air, a microwave, and it sounds ridiculous, but when you live the way that I have and grew up the way that I did, once you get certain comforts, like a nice bed, um, like fences around you, and walls, like I have, and security, you're willing to go to work. You're willing to pay that price because it's ultimately worth it to you. And that's what I thought to myself because I'd ultimately given up on philosophy and given up on everything and just went to my job. And it's not a drab, gray view of the world. I mean, I think that's the profundity of it. That's the power of it, because, Tolstoy has that old title that the kingdom is within. And I'm not a Christian and I'm not religious. However, I don't believe in metaphysics either. I don't believe in spirituality. But I do think there's a deep profundity to the notion that the kingdom is within. However, there's a flip to this, which is that to me, the inside is actually the outside, and what we call the inside is a reflection of the outside. And in fact, in short, what I mean to say is that the kingdom is in the senses. It's in the body, you know. And so there's a sense in which when you return to the body, you recover that sense. And when I say body, I don't mean body alone, because the body itself is not isolated, but the body as it exists in a web of relations to other things that once you begin to grasp, ultimately blur the boundaries of what you even think of as being a body. But again, it's not a mystical thing. It's not, I'm not making a metaphysical claim. I'm simply suggesting that the value and meaning of a life is found in specifics. It's found in what's called the aesthetic. And the aesthetic isn't art necessarily, but aesthesis means the senses. It means the sensory world. And so the sensory world itself, to me, is a nominalist, is always specific. And I'm not necessarily trying to be complicated, but what I mean to suggest is that if you can learn to use your mind for what it is, which is like something that can be used instrumentally, say philosophically, something that can be used to understand the world as a way of modestly improving one's own life, i.e. thinking ahead into the near future, using your mind to make shopping lists. You can, and ultimately learning how to think critically, you can ultimately free yourself to a practice that is akin to aesthesis, that goes beyond aesthesis. And that's something that sort of has to be brought down to earth as an idea, because it's an idea that expands. And in fact, you could say that if the meaning of life is to be found in anything like specificity, like art, then it is to be found in the immediacy of our lives. And this art, this aesthesis, isn't to be located in some faraway, privileged locus of aesthetic splendor, i.e. museums or art schools. If the aesthetic is to be found in everyday life, and if one is to see the limitations of an instrumental mind, and if one is to see that the point of politics isn't to replace life, and that there are realities and problems that are not resolved by a political or scientific process, if you can lead yourself into seeing that the aesthetic is an ontology, in fact, to use philosophical language, well, then you begin to find great, I think, meaning, and in fact, music in the everyday life that you lead. And of course, the problem with what I'm saying is that I'm still too abstract, because the aesthetic is something that, if we are bodies, is something that has to be lived out existentially. And so I come back around full circle to the question of how it is that this has any meaning to my life. Like, why am I talking about all this? Well, because here's what I mean to say. I found incredible peace in spite of anything. And I think that I still can. I still have that right now. I have a peace of mind. It's just that when I ask myself, am I happy? The question is no. And I've achieved a lot. I turned my life around. I've paid my debts. I've got my teeth fixed. I have a job. I have insurance. I have, of course, friends. I have food. I have everything that I need. But at the same time, why is it that I'm not? Why is it that I'm making these recordings? Why is it that I'm writing? Well, I think it's because I have a Promethean complex, you might say, a Promethean complex that makes me a little bit more Greek than I am Buddhist. And by being a little bit more Greek, I mean that I have a taste for that friction. I have a taste for that fiction. I have a taste to push myself. And I know that my life could be better if I exercise a little bit more control and a little bit more understanding. And in fact, I can't be anything but that. As I was writing about earlier in my diary, the thing about Nietzsche is that one really learns how to turn. And by turning, I mean one can lead oneself or be led to the abyss, to the opening, to the void. But the question is whether you want to stand there dumbly staring into it. And the question is, how long can you take before it starts to stare into you? That's the Nietzschean question. So if you combine that, and by that I mean that Nietzsche's suggesting that that there's an inborn need for stories, that there's an inborn need for narratives, for meaning to be made, that one can't survive what people call nihilism. So if you combine that with the Promethean drive, that leads you to admit that you are not, in fact, happy. It's not that you're completely in turmoil. I'm not in despair. I'm not fractured. I'm not, you know what I mean? Like none of those words, whether Freudian or Marxian, really apply. But at the same time, there's a modest sense of possibility or potential, of potentiality. You sort of want to see if you can use a little bit of it, make a little bit of it, and maybe improve your life a little bit. And I think that's the path that I'm on. And there is a sense in which it's not in my control. At the same time, there's a sense in which it's not in my control because it's not in my understanding. And if you don't have a sense of that, you can't really move with life. And that's where that underlying sense of peace can come from. So it's not that one is saying that they're not happy, but that one would be a little bit happier if you brought this peace into the world. And not only that, but that you practiced living in such a way that you can't simply go home and be in your little isolated, peaceful world. And so the question is, how do you take that peace out there, and what does that mean, And what I mean is that on another level, if a person's going to overcome a lot of great difficulty in life and trauma, there's a sense in which the exercise of will is probably important. But another thing that's important is willlessness, is just getting away from all that and then doing nothing and recovering. And in fact, that's what I've been doing for 10 years now. For 10 years, I've been turning my life around and getting everything focused. But at the same time, I've allowed myself to relax and pull way back into myself. I think that's just as important. If you're to discover ultimately what it is that's being said to you that is actually right in front of you, and you didn't take the time to see it. So I guess that's why it's important to slow down and find that peace so that you can see what is right in front of you. And I know that I haven't exactly even answered my own question regarding what it is that I'm trying to do and how it is that I'm going to get out of my situation, or even what my situation is in. It's just that on a daily level, I've been practicing this for years and using these recordings as creating leverage, as a way of detaching so that I can hear myself. And in many ways, you could say it's the inverse when you're listening to others in a podcast or something, because I suppose what you're hearing is yourself when you listen to other people. It's interesting because we sort of mirror ourselves and sort of mimic others, at least invisibly within ourselves. And so there's a sense in which if there are other lives to be lived, it's within this one, and it's possible within your own mind to live out as many thoughts as there are people out there. And I think that kind of openness is what gives you the sort of space that you need to be able to turn, and to be able to keep turning, and to be able to turn enough so that you can actually capture yourself turning and maybe see yourself for a second, if only to turn away once again.